Hello, everybody. So this is the Southern Hellenic. I am back with another streaming video. So this is from the Agora. Later on, I'll put from the Agora on it so people know it's part of the same series of videos that I am doing. So I actually had to look up how to spell the martyrdom or the martyrdom, whatever pronounce it, and I had to look up her name in order to be able to spell it correctly, so that I posted on, say, Hellenic Pagans, it would be correctly spelled. So there you go. So one of the things that I'm gonna be doing in a series of videos, and I think I've mentioned this before, is talking about a series of people or topics or whatever, and hopefully I will get people on to talk about it in more detail, and to that way we get a good amount of time in on the video. And yeah, so what the heck? This can't connect with chat. What the heck? No, I don't want to do that. Okay. All right, so it looks like I'm unable to connect with chat. So you're not going to be able to post your questions, apparently. Apparently their chat's down, so I'm sorry about that if you're not able to comment or whatever you want to do. All right. I said, please try again later. Oh, well, I'm not going to try again later. So if you guys want to post comments on the video, you can do it down below when it becomes available. So one of the things that is really interesting about later Roman Empire, especially during the time when Christianity was starting to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, is there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of shit going on. There was a lot of people vying for power, and it was also a time when women were starting to gain power within the church. Later on, they were removed from those positions of power. So at the core of Christianity, it's all about loving your neighbor, and taking care of the poor, and following the teachings of Christ, and all this stuff. What ended up happening as time progressed on, and it was a religion of the poor, it was a religion of women, it was a religion of people that were ignored by Roman society. What ended up happening was Roman society infected Christianity to the point where it became just like Roman society. So during the time that this happened, as far as I have been able to read, you see a lot of movies about this period of time, especially the destruction of the temples, the killing of people for no good reason other than they were breathing oxygen, which, if you talk to any scholar of the early church, they will tell you this behavior was totally unacceptable. And they don't look upon this period of time with fondness. The death of Hypatia was considered the end of the classical period. So one death ended it all, according to a lot of scholars who do research during this time period. So when we have a woman who is greatly respected by a lot of men, especially a lot of men in power, and because she taught them when they were younger. And so while Christian chroniclers celebrated her death, a lot of people that she taught mourned her death. especially the people that really, in fact, liked her. Um, and what ended up happening was all the philosophers fled. The school in Athens was closed down. This was an attack on philosophy. It was also an attack, it was also a reminder to any Christians who dared to debate core aspects of the religion that, hey, we did this to her, we're going to do it to you. Now, the mob that killed her actually came from the desert. Why? Because the emperor banished them to the desert, because he couldn't stand them. They were completely out of control. These people did not care who they killed. They would kill Christians if they could get away with it. And because they were so barbaric, so bloodthirsty, so savage, the emperor banished them to the desert. So what does this bishop do? He invites them back probably without the emperor's knowledge. And word got back to the emperor, and the emperor, of course, banished them once again to the desert, and probably said to bishops that they were not allowed back in, or else, guess what? The emperors could be really brutal. When you didn't do what an emperor told you to do, you generally receive the brutal end of his wrath. But now, we're not saying the emperor was sorry that temples were being torn down or converted to churches. In fact, it was the conversion of a temple to a church that aided in its preservation, because money was still flowing in to maintain the building and the columns and the roof and all that stuff. So if some church that used to be a temple had a leaky roof, money would be allotted for the roof to be fixed. So, why was she hated by the people in charge, especially because what a lot of people don't understand is, yes, the emperor had power, he had authority, but his authority was not as powerful or as unlimited as it had been prior to Constantine declaring Christianity a legalized religion. Basically, the emperor really did not have any power. I mean, he could banish, bloodthirsty monks and psychotic lunatics out into the desert, but the church as an institution had the ability to bring them back. So, in other words, you could banish somebody to the desert because they basically ate people, but then if a bishop liked how he ate people, bring them back, let them eat more people. All the emperor could do was banish them. I would have personally killed them, but that's just me. So, I'm not going to go through Wikipedia because I don't really trust Wikipedia. This is from www.ancient.au. So, all right. It says here, Hypatia of Alexandria was a female philosopher and mathematician born in Alexandria, Egypt, possibly in 370 CE. She was the daughter of the mathematician Theon, the last professor at the University of Alexandria, who tutored her in math, astronomy, and philosophy of the day, which in modern times would be considered science. Nothing is known of her mother, and there is little information about her life. She was murdered in 415 CE by a Christian mob who attacked her on the streets of Alexandria. The primary source, even those Christian writers who were hostile to her and claimed she was a witch, are generally sympathetic in recording her death as a tragedy. These accounts routinely depicted Hypatia as a woman who was widely known for her generosity, love of learning, and expertise in teaching the subject of Neo-Platonism, mathematics, science, and philosophy. Alexandria, Egypt, was founded on the site of an old port city by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. Alexander is said to have drawn up the plans for the city himself and left construction up to his commander Cleomenes of Alexandria himself, continuing on his military campaigns. Okay, so Ptolemy first established the Library of Alexandria, the museum, and the Temple of Serapis, and turned the city into a cultural center rivaling Athens. All right. So, so it's it's they do a lot of history of it, and then it says here when the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great made Christianity the state religion, which is not true. That was Theodosia. Theodosia made Christianity the state religion, not Constantine. The Christians Alexander brutally persecuted now felt empowered to strike back at their pagan adversaries. By Hypatia's time, religious difference and rivalries regularly divided the city and erupted into violence. In the city, which was becoming increasingly diverse religiously and had always been so culturally, Hypatia was a close friend of the pagan prefect Oriatus and was blamed by Cyril, the Christian Archbishop of Alexandria, for keeping Oriatus from accepting the true faith. She had also seen as a stumbling block to those who would have accepted the truth of Christianity were it not for her charisma, charm, and excellence in making difficult mathematical and philosophical concepts understandable to her students, concepts which contracted the teachings of a relatively new church. By all accounts, Hypatia was an extraordinary woman not only for her time, but for any time, and a popular public speaker. Michael Deakins cited the ancient historian Dominicus describing her public lectures. Her father, Theron, refused to impose upon his daughter the traditional role assigned to women and raised her as one would raise a son in Greek tradition, by teaching her his own trade. Hypatia, on the other hand, led the life of a respected academic in Alexandria, university position to which only males were entitled previously. Dilkin points out that she surpassed her well-respected father as evidenced by ancient testimonies to her brilliance. She never married and remained celibate throughout her life, devoting herself to learning and teaching. The ancient writers are in agreement that she was a woman of enormous intellectual power. Even the Christian writers, such as John of Nakodu, who were hostile towards her, Dilkin comments, says here, the breadth of her interest is most impressive within mathematics. She wrote on lectures on astronomy, geometry, and algebra, and made advances in computeral technique, as well as engaged in religious philosophy and aspiring to a good writing style. This heritage was so impressive that Alexandria rivaled Athens as a jewel of learning and culture. From the reign of Ptolemy I, Alexandria had grown to emblematize the best aspects of civilized urban life. Even in relative decline, the city was still marveled of the Mediterranean world. Early writers like Strabro described the city as magnificent, and the university was held in such high regard that scholars continued to flock there from around the world in spite of the religious rivalries and violence. All right. Okay, so it says here, Alexandria was still a great seat of learning in the early days of Christianity, but as the faith grew in inheritance and power became increasingly divided by fighting among religious factions. It is by no means an exaggeration to claim that Alexandria was destroyed as a center of culture and learning by religious intolerance, and Hypatia came to symbolize this tragedy to the extent that her death has been cited as the end of the classical world. The Archbishop Cyril was routinely frustrated by Hypatia's popularity and her friendship with the prefect Oriatus. The Christian chronicler explained the situation from Cyril's point of view. In those days, there appeared in Alexandria a female philosopher, a pagan named Hypatia, and she was devoted at all times to magic, can't pronounce it, and instruments of music, and she beguiled many people through her satanic wiles. And the governor of the city honored her exceedingly, for she had beguiled him through her magic, and he ceased attending church as he had been his custom. The tension increased when Oriatus had a man named, I can't pronounce it, a zealous Christian wanted to serve his men publicly punished for inciting violence. He had slipped into a synagogue to spy on the Jewish community for Cyril, and in order to find any evidence of Jewish plans against Christians. When the Jews noticed him, they complained to Oriatus, and apparently he was taken to be punished. The enraged Cyril, who encouraged the Christian community to attack the Jews, The Jews were killed and the survivors expelled from the city, while their possessions were appropriated by the Christians and synagogues converted to churches. Now, this kind of, if you really look at this, you kind of look at it as the beginning of the intolerance that Christians had towards Jews. So one of the things that Jews are accused of is the murder of Christ, even though it was the Roman Empire that actually crucified Christ and therefore killed him. The reason why they wanted this prisoner freed, but not Jesus, even though the Roman Empire found that he wasn't doing anything wrong, was because they needed him to try to revolt against the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers, in the end, they did find the guy and ended up killing him, which was, for the best. So you talk about like Christian victories over paganism. Well, there's supposed Christian victories over Jews. Of course, in the end, it's the Jews that have a state and, Christians that don't. So it says, in the religious frenzy inspired by their victories over the Jews, the mob then went searching for Hypatia. In 415 CE, on her way home from delivering her daily lectures at the university, Hypatia was attacked by this mob, consistently large of Christian monks, dragged from her chariot down the street to a church, and was there stripped naked, beaten to death, and burned. So it says here, so she basically, she was attacked by a bunch of half-starved men. It's like, seriously, I'm pretty sure they ate her or something. I don't know. They're starved. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It says here, in the aftermath of her death, the University of Alexandria was sacked and burned on orders of Cyril. Pagan temples were torn down, and there was a mass exodus of intellectuals and artists from Alexandria. Cyril was later declared a saint by the church for his efforts to suppressing paganism and fighting for the true faith. Hypatia's death had long been recognized as a watershed mark in history, delineating the classical age of paganism from the age of Christianity. Okay, it says here, the film sparked controversy upon its release from some segments of the Christian community who objected to the depiction of early Christians as fanatical enemies of learning and culture. History is clear, however, that Alexandria began to decline as Christianity rose in power, and the death of Hypatia of Alexandria has come to embody all that was lost in civilization, the tumult of religious intolerance, and the destruction it engenders. All right, so yeah, so they got pissed off about it. But so people, ask, how did this even start? I mean, people will go and they'll read about her death and they're like, how did it start? How in the world did it get to this point where people were willing to act like savage dogs and literally rip someone's limbs off? I mean, literally just rip them off like dogs. And so let's go back several hundred years before she was even born, before her father was even born, before her grandfather was even born, before her great-grandfather was even born. So we go and look at Christianity got started with the death of Christ. And Christ, of course, would have never condoned that. Yeah. So anyways, so you have the emergence of this religion, and it arrives to the Roman Empire via the roads. Now, the Romans were very proud of their roads. They loved their roads. The roads are still being used today in some parts. So you had these roads, and these roads allow trade of ideas, trade of all sorts of different types of things. And what ended up happening was Christianity came to Rome. And Christianity originally was a religion of the poor, the downtrodden, the slaves, and most importantly, the women. So you had women that spent money to feed Christians, to clothe them, medical care. I mean, Christians got better medical care than polytheists did, especially if they were poor. So this was all paid for by rich Christians who had money to pay for this stuff. So what ended up happening was the Roman Empire decided to do a series of things. I'd say that, but one of them was that to boost morale, the emperor, I don't remember which emperor it was, wanted everybody to give a little bit of incense to the gods for unity, and Christians refused to do it. They were like, no, we're not going to do this. And so what ended up happening was the Roman Empire decided to start persecuting Christians. Now it wasn't a lot of scholars really have said that what people have been fed about, hundreds of thousands of Christians being killed and stuff like that in the Colosseum is actually blown out of proportion. Just like the idea that 12 million witches were burned at the stake. And so it wasn't constant. It wasn't constant. Because a lot of emperors saw the writing on the wall. If you continue to persecute this religion, it's going to get more and more and more popular to the point where we're going to end up being the victims next. So what ended up happening was, as Christianity grew and grew and grew and more people were persecuted, they were all waiting for some kind of sign that they would finally be able to get back at the people of Rome. It happened when Constantine had said that he saw a sign of the cross in the sky, which was written down much later after his death, which means we can really, really doubt that he actually had this dream. He was just lucky that he won. So, yeah. So what ended up happening was, you had his sons who did what they did, and what ended up happening was, Constantine's sons were Christian. They were raised in the church. They were raised to take power after their father died, and one of their sore spots was the pagans or the polytheists who were in Rome at the time. There was things like the altar of victory was removed. You couldn't sacrifice to the gods. You couldn't do this. You couldn't do that. If you were a Christian, and they found out you were in good, word with your relatives, you would lose your property and your rights. So the church did a lot of things to get back at the Roman Empire for what happened hundreds of years prior, over 100 years prior. So you had this, and they were far more brutal to the polytheists of the Roman Empire than the polytheists had ever been to them. So basically, they would become Christian, and then they would go out there and they would commit all these heinous acts, and they would butcher people, and they would tear down temples, and it was as though they changed for the worse. So like for instance, you have people that convert to Islam, and this is not all the time, but sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they will commit violence against other people, but they already has to have that tendency in their heart and then they just convert to Islam, and then they just go and kill people. But that is always a outer reflection of what they've been wanting to do for a long time. So you had this destruction of pagan temples, and what ended up happening was they also burned books, they burned all this stuff, all this knowledge, that had been accumulated for the last 5,000 years or 3,000 years. And what ended up happening was when all the intellectuals fled, they fled to other countries where they had more religious tolerance and freedom from with the rulers. And what ended up happening was Alexandria ended up becoming a waste. It became a place you really didn't want to go unless you had no choice in the matter. So Alexander became from a place that was revered to a place you really didn't want to go to. Um, it wasn't the great epicenter of learning, and it's kind of it amazes me when you go when you go and have a movie like this, and the Christians are like, that's not how it was back then. It's exactly how it was back then. And a lot of pastors will say, yeah, that's exactly how it was back then. So yeah. So yes, it was exactly how it was back then. I think it's like they live in an entirely different time from these people, and they're like they cannot imagine um, you know people who are supposed to be Christ-like going around and slaughtering people as they stood. So, but yes, the history is very clear on it. It's very clear. The early church was a bunch of barbaric nutsacks that they basically they lived on the blood of of innocent people. And then of course that was that one emperor that killed children. Yeah, we don't talk about him. Yeah, so if it's like if you try to Google it, then it tells you the date, and then you figure out which emperor did it. Yeah, you'll figure out which emperor promoted it. But the point about her death was it really told the intellectuals they were no longer wanted. So the intellectuals and the artists left, and basically left Alexandria to its own demise. And what ended up happening was the Muslims came along and they conquered Alexandria, and they imposed a tax on Christians that they had to pay. If they converted to Islam, they didn't have to pay it. And that's how Alexandria went from a predominantly Christian city to a predominantly Muslim city, all the way to a predominantly Muslim country. So a lot of people will say, well, the reason that Alexandria is now a predominantly Muslim country is because if you believe in karma, you will say this is their punishment for basically being a bunch of barbaric nutsacks. So it's a good lesson that there's always going to be repercussions to your actions, and even if it doesn't happen right away, something's going to come along. So there was a force that was a lot greater than any god or gods. It was Muslims, and they were there to conquer Alexandria and to make it an Islamic country. So yeah, so the people of Alexandria, they got paid back for what they did. But so why is her martyrdom such a painful thing? Because she was a bright woman, because she was everything that these monks would never be. They were so fanatical about their beliefs. They were so fanatical about that they were right and you were wrong, and there was nothing you could do about it. And the fact is, they defiled a church with blood. It's like they dragged her into God's house, and they literally massacred her at the altar that's supposed to be for God. And it was such a gruesome sight, and I'm pretty sure it turned a lot of people's stomachs that this mob hated this woman so much they actually defiled a church to get rid of her. So it's sad that she died this way. But as modern day Hellenics, we look at her and we see the high cost of intolerance. We see what happens when we allow intolerance to grow and to fester like it did. And we sit there and we say, we need to be better than than they were. And a lot of times we are better than they were, but there's still old prejudices, there's still religious intolerance, and it still is ugly, and it's nasty, and it's unnecessary. It's just absolutely unnecessary. But we need to fight that. We need to bring enlightenment and logic and reasoning to to the world. We need to continue to. We don't need to be fanatical about intellectual and logic and stuff like that. We still should let people have their beliefs, but we also need to understand and take her death as a lesson. And that's the great thing about history. It always has a lesson to teach. It always sits there and says, look at what happened 1500 1400 years ago, and let's learn from that, and let's not be like that. And I think that is probably the most important thing that we can get from it. So the point of destroying the temples and outlawing the practices that had been the glue that held society together for centuries was to change society and introduce a new system. And the thing about it is that one of the huge reasons that it took 20-some years for paganism to be recognized as a religion in Greece is because they did not want to acknowledge that all of their efforts, all the centuries of work they done, was now literally going down the toilet because the EU has these rules. EU has laws. You have to follow these laws. And they kept on getting over and over and over again, kept on getting fined and fined and fined for violation of the rules that they had agreed to when they joined. So as modern day Hellenics, we, every time that we stand before our altars, every time we light our candle, every time we burn incense, every time we say a prayer to the gods, we remember her. We remember a time when this right was being taken away from the Greeks, from my ancestors who were Roman. And we remember the temples being torn down and Hypatia being brutally murdered and the church being polluted with her blood. And we sit there, we stand there, and we're grateful that we live in a country where we have these religious freedoms, that this kind of mob mentality not only is not permitted, but also is prosecuted by civil authorities. So we remember Hypatia tomorrow. We light a candle to her memory, and we are thankful and grateful that we do not live in those times. We live in the now. We have these rights, and we honor her. Okay, so I'm going to end it here. I hope you guys enjoy the video. It's, and before I go, I want to say happy first day of spring. Persephone is back in the land above ground as Cora again. And so I'll end it there. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope it gave you some food for thought, and I'll see you guys around. So until next time, be blessed.